Hi and welcome. So this time around we're going to take a look at some angle grinders, but no, not these angle grinders. Instead we're going to take a look at some Harbor Freight angle grinders, and I actually bought one of each of their main series of angle grinders because there's big price point differences, and I've always been very curious what's the difference between them. You know, how much better is their high-end model from their low-end model? Most manufacturers like DeWalt and Porter Cable and Hitachi, they just sort of have their tools, and sometimes maybe like Milwaukee has their regular line, their fuel line for a slightly higher end line, but oftentimes there's not a lot of difference between them. The Harbor Freight vary tremendously, and there is a significant price difference from, like, I don't know, $16 or $17 at the low end to like $80 or $90 at the high end. So there's a very big price difference. And I'd like to compare them and see what the difference is in prices versus what you get for the money. So let's go take a look at that. I tried to get similar of each kind. So they're all paddle switch on, and they're all wired. So there's no wireless, cordless versions of these. Harbor Freight does sell a whole line of cordless ones, maybe some point in the future. I didn't actually need 3 more angle grinders, although having a lot of angle grinders with different different wheels and things on them can be really handy to have, so it's not particularly a problem. So the 3 lines I have here are Hercules, which is their top of the line, Bauer, their middle line, and Chicago, which is their low end line, which is currently being replaced by Warrior, I think. And I didn't get the Warrior, number 1, because my Harbor Freight didn't have any, and number 2, because the only Warrior version they had was the slide switch version. This one is a paddle like all the others, so I want to make them as similar as possible. So right off the bat, this is kind of an interesting observation. The Chicago version has very thin cardboard packaging. The Bauer is double thickness cardboard of the similar type to this, and the Hercules is thicker still. And I think that's very interesting that they've made the packaging reflect a little bit, supposedly, the quality level of the hardware that's contained within. All right, so let's cover these one by one, which is kind of amusing here. So for the Chicago, they claim it's 6 amps. Standard 5/8 inch 11 spindle, 10,000 RPM at 120 volts. They don't put a weight on here, although I think I printed that out. Let's see if I can find that. 4.19 pounds. So the low end model is 4.19 pounds. It's got all the standard features, you know, guard required by OSHA, an aluminum housing for the gears, a large paddle switch. Bottom line, I think the most common comparisons will be weight, current, which is probably shorting current, not free running, no load current, and grinding speed, 10,000 RPM. Next up, we have the Bauer, 8 amps, no load, 11,500 RPM, and they're saying it weighs 4 pounds. Let's see what we have here. Product weight, 4 pounds even. So just slightly lighter than the Chicago, 0.2 of a pound lighter. And then we come up to the top of the line Hercules here, and we have an 11 amp motor at 11,000 RPM, and product weight 5 pounds, actually heavier. So next observation is that they have this little disclaimer here on these guys, is that the picture may not represent what's actually in the box because of continuing improvements. But we all know, anyone who's shipped at Harbor Freight knows that they may have 2 or 3 SKUs for the exact same tool at any one time in the store, based on probably which manufacturer they got it from, I'm guessing. So in any case, so this item number, you can have like 3 or 4 item numbers for the Chicago paddle switch plug-in, angle grind, 4.5 inch angle grinder, which I find very amusing that they're constantly, I think, switching vendors more than they're improving so much at the time. Although I will give Harbor Freight credit, in the last few years they've really been pushing on improving the quality of their tools. So, and it's noticeable. So also their prices are going up along with it. So eventually if they get high-end tools, are they going to have high-end prices? I'm thinking probably so. All right, so let's open these guys up and see what's different about them. Starting with the Chicago Electric in this very flimsy box. Just trying to pull the tab open. the box rips. Oh, look at that. It does come with a grinding wheel. It comes with a made in China 12,000 RPM grinding wheel. Huh, very interesting. So I didn't expect it to come with a grinding wheel because that's one of the features they claim with their more expensive models. That's a big bonus. Wow, and look at this. Even though it's not advertised on the outside of the box, there's motor brushes in here. That's really interesting. Kind of impressed because this guy went for like 17 bucks. So continuing along, there's the model number of this particular, they have several versions of the Chicago angle grinder, by the way. They have I think they have a 4-inch, and they make obviously the thumb switch style rather than the paddle switch style. I think most professionals prefer the paddle switch because you can't accidentally leave it on. It's got a safety, so you can even set it on the switch and it won't turn on. So it comes with the manual. The manual is all about safety disclaimers. Wow. So the first 6 pages of the 8 pages of the manual are pretty much warning. And it continues. Wow, I'm still wrong. It's still continuing on page 9 all the way through page 9. Then next is just basic how to use the grinder. Most of us never look at these things. So it's got an inexpensive wrench here, pin wrench. It looks like just press fit. Oh, sort of hammer riveted pins in there. And I guess we can pop the wheel in that came with it. It looks like this one, oh, it has an adapter plate in here for different size arbors. So I think this wheel that's in there now, nope, is too big for that. So you use the adapter as sort of a reducer and support. And then this guy probably nests in there. It looks almost like looks almost stamped, this wheel nut here. No, but it is machined. It was turned. You can see the turning marks on it. And here's the wheel lock that is very common among these guys. And then you can take the spanner, the pin spanner, and tighten it down. And there we go. The wheel guard is fairly close. And it looks like the wheel guard is just 2 Phillips tightened down. It's a pinch fit. And they put some little dimples in it. So it sort of feels like it catches on some indents, but doesn't really adequately catch. So it comes with a moderately long cord. Let's see how long this cord is. A long cord on these guys can be really handy. So the cord's about 6 feet long on this guy. And the paddle switch has a good feel to it, surprisingly. It's a little sticky. Yeah, it kind of jams every once in a while, so the safety part to flip that in can be a little sticky. And it has a lock to lock it on the back, which is kind of interesting. I haven't seen that in too many of them. And it supports a handle in 3 positions. Not all of them support 3 positions. So that is the cursory outside look at the Chicago electric 4.5-inch paddle switch angle grinder. Let's move on to the next model up. Next up, we have the Bauer. Opens differently. Harbor Freight's not consistent about their packaging the way it opens. There is a lot more internal packaging on the Bauer than there was on the Chicago. The Chicago is sitting free inside the box. This guy has some packing cardboard to separate some pieces. So a lot more packaging, which is not exactly a good thing for the environment. It looks like it comes in more pieces. The guard looks like it's significantly better built than the Chicago. And the fit and finish of the whole thing is surprisingly nice just looking at the outside. The paddle switch is very smooth and easy to use. Also has a lock in a different spot. You could actually activate that very easily. The overall quality, just the fit and finish comparison, it looks significantly better than the Chicago. It has a much, much longer AC cord. The pin spanner for the wheel was painted on top of just being a press fit. And so it looks like it's slightly better quality. Just outward appearance. I don't know if it's actually better quality. And the Bauer did not come with any wheels. What do you know? Has the same sort of adapter pieces, much better looking, plus this one looks like it catches a keyed spot down on the bottom where the Chicago is just floating. These two wheel flanges are just floating. They feel beefier. I don't think they actually are. These are chrome plated, so nicer in that regard. And only 2 position handle locations. Nice positive wheel lock. And does not come with brushes. So the middle of the line one does not come with any brushes. And going back to the Chicago, interestingly enough, there's no external obvious way to replace the brushes that it came with. So you would actually have to take this apart to get to the brushes. Presumably, you'd have to take this guy apart to get the brushes, except it doesn't come with any. The extra long AC cord is definitely a plus. Next up is the Hercules. Also, a whole lot more packaging, and unlike the Bauer that comes out of the end of a tube, this one is presentation packaging. So when you open it up, you're presented with the tool in all its glory. So I think the marketeers definitely thought about that a little bit. Also comes with a manual and a lot more packaging, because we need packaging. The box is much, much heavier. This one comes with the wheel guard installed. A very nicely long cord as well. This one has spare brushes, and just looking at the brushes, they are much, much beefier than the little guy. Here's the Chicago brushes. Here are the Hercules brushes. So you can see that to start with, they're much beefier, which allows much more current to flow. It might give you a little more longevity as well, because you've got more surface area. Funny enough, the pin spanner looks a lot more reminiscent of the inexpensive Chicago one, just sort of plated, chrome plated or zinc plated tool, a little bit beefier. It's thicker metal than the other one. But I gotta say, the Bauer with its painted or oxide coated, I think it's painted, that's painted, looks probably a little bit better yet, although it's not as thick. This is the thickest of the 3 so far, which I think is really odd. Much notably smoother paddle switch on this one even than the Bauer. Although there is some side-to-side play in it, which gives you, that lack of precision feeling. It also has a lock, so all 3 have locks. A fairly long AC cord. It feels heavier in the hand. Also only has a 2-position handle. So apparently for their high-end models, they figure the straight up position is not something people use enough to warrant putting in. Also has adapter pieces. Let's see if I can get this guy off. Oh, that's on there. Why is it on there so much? Also keyed to the base. And the Bauer version just has bare aluminum for the wheel guard mount. This one, they anodized it. Oh, I see. What I'm feeling here is a rubber O-ring they put on there. Maybe that's to keep this captive so you don't drop it. Yeah, there's an O-ring right here that that holds this guy in place. I'm not sure why that's particularly useful, but I do not use a angle grinder in a professional setting. Maybe if I did, I'd have a better feeling for why they bothered with that. Positive wheel lock. All right, that's the quick cursory overview. I got to say the fit and finish is also very nice on the outside of this guy. Here are the three side by side. And you can just tell the fit and finish is somewhat different. Let's pop these handles off of each one for now. So you can see the handle differences between the three. The Hercules is shaped a little bit more, and then down to this generic-ish one on the Chicago Electric. I can tell you that this one feels notably heavier in the hand. It's thinner than the next models down, so easier to get your hand around further. These are much wider. This one's significantly wider. This one has some sort of plasticky rubberized coating. I think it's even a different material. This one had, and there's no overmold on this one. These guys have, oh, just this one has overmold. This one does not. This is just different colored plastic of the same type, which is kind of interesting. So next up, to fire these guys up to hear what they sound like, I'm going to take off the wheels that came with them. I'm going to replace them all with these Hitachi wheels that are identical, just so we can have like with like. It's interesting to note that any of these wrenches fit in any of these devices, which means I'm a little curious as to why Harbor Freight bothered making more than one wrench at all. Why didn't they just have all one wrench made in the same factory and put them in all their devices? I guess for differentiation, but seems sort of pointless. This thin little light gauge one is just worth throwing in the garbage, because I can use the high-end one on the Chicago, no problem. The flanges are beefier on the two higher end models. Not that I think that makes a significant difference, because I don't think the slightly thinner gauge material or the thinner thickness one is going to make any difference at all on the lower end model. So of all these, the wheel seating feels much more positive in the high end ones than the other ones. I don't know if that's because they made the ridge a little bit thicker, but it definitely feels more, it feels like it locks in a more positive fashion than these two here. That's a very minor difference. That's just sort of a fit and finish, the way it feels kind of comparison. In practical comparison, probably makes zero difference. Also to observe, the high-end Hercules came with a Hercules wheel. Harbor Freight sells 3 different grades of wheels: Hercules, Bauer, and some name for their lower end one. This is their lower end one. They are all made in China, I believe. Yeah, made in China. The quality of the wheels, this one looks like it has extra fiberglass covering on it, which is kind of interesting. The Hercules does. This one's just a sintered wheel. This one is sintered with fiber. Oh, actually, there's no fiberglass reinforcement externally on the low end wheel at all. The high-end wheel has fiberglass, what looks like fiberglass and adhesive material covering the wheel. I don't know that I even want to use this one at all, because this one could explode on you without any reinforcing material to hold the pieces in place in case it blows apart. All right, so comparing the cables, the longest cable is the Bauer by like 2 feet, which is kind of interesting. However, these two guys are 18 gauge and this one is 16 gauge. And you can see the comparison here that it is much thicker. Well, in some cases that would be just insulation, but in this one they claim on the outside of the insulation that it is thicker. And for the Chicago Electric, the AC cord feels like it's vinyl, and both the Bauer and the Hercules feel like they're rubber. Next up, I just want to do something simple as a sound test to compare the difference in sounds. So I'm going to pop on my safety glasses before I fire these guys up. And we're just going to listen to these in turn. So here is the Chicago Electric. It's actually pretty smooth sounding. Here's the Bauer. And the Hercules. That's very interesting. So where they sit on the wheel guard, the Hercules is farther out than the Bauer. Oh, that's because the safety guard is not on all the way. I didn't get it on right. It's keyed. That's my bad. Maybe it would have helped to have read the manual, huh? Yeah, okay. The Bauer is keyed for so that it can't fall off even if this is loose. It has to be in a very specific position, and then you have to pop it over. So let's listen to this one again. One more time. Interesting. The one that makes the least sort of crunchy noise is this guy. All right, next up, let's actually measure the current of these three guys, just their free running current, no load current. Now, I'm sure their rated current has something to do with like stalling current or something like that. We're not going to do that. Instead, I've made this extension cord here that's just bare wires so that I can get on the hot leg and measure the current separately. It's all insulated, so it is safe. All right, so let's start with the Chicago Electric, and let's look at its free running current. About 2.8 amps. And let's let the meter catch its max current on startup. It may not catch the total peak, but about 9.5 amps. So we have 2 and change amps free running, 9 and change amps on startup. Let's try the Bauer next. All right, so let's do startup or free running current. About 3.3 amps. And let's look at its max current on startup. About 13.5 amps. Finally, let's take a look at the Hercules. Start with this free running current. About 5.8 amps. And let's catch its max current on startup. About 22 amps. Much beefier motor. So sequentially these have beefier motors. The magnetic field is a combination of the number of windings and the amount of current. And so typically, all things being equal, more current means a more powerful motor, but you can get away with having more windings and lower current. Typically, the way they try and get consumers to compare these things is the more current, the beefier the motor. So they're claiming that this guy here is beefier. It certainly has a much bigger startup current and also has a significantly higher free running current. All right, so next up, let's pop the wheels out of here and let's open these up and look inside and see if we can see any obvious construction differences. So right off the bat with construction, interesting, the 2 lower end models have Phillips screws and the higher end model has a Torx. Not only does it have Torx, it has 5 Torx screws, 4 Phillips for the Bauer for the rear mechanical section, and 3 for the Chicago Electric. Every time you add in another screw to install, that's another, X number of seconds for a person on the line to take to put that screw in. So this one takes more time to build, to put together than the other 2. That makes it more expensive labor costs, and that's not something that is missing from the mind of a manufacturing engineer. Starting with the Chicago Electric, 3 screws pop off and the whole thing explodes in your hand. The locking mechanism with the with the lock right there, as well as the tabs controlled switch, the paddle controlled switch assembly. It's plastic, looks like glass reinforced plastic just by the way it shines. Definitely not terribly sturdy. And it looks like what they did was they attached, so it's clamshell, and it looks like what they did was they attached the switch itself to the top portion along with strain relief for the power cord. Here are the brushes on the motor, so that's what you have to assemble to get to the brushes, and the brushes are held in with a clip. The motor windings, as they reach the stator, are epoxied. That's a very positive sign, actually. And that's pretty much the rear of this guy. So the locking mechanism for the Chicago Electric is just this little piece of plastic with a clip on the end that catches right in here. It is a very cheesy mechanism, not very impressive at all. But, you know, it felt moderately positive, so I guess it just depends on how long it survives. All right, let's take a look at the Bauer. So this whole assembly is kind of a pain in the butt to put back together because everything's sort of spring-loaded and, you know, held in place by the clamshell itself, which means that if you have to replace the brushes on this thing, you're going to be struggling. Next up is the Bauer. It is not a clamshell style. Oh, it is. It is a clamshell, but everything remained in place when I disassembled it. It has replaceable brushes. They look identical brushes, like identical brushes to the Hercules. Also epoxied the wires going to the stator on this guy. Spring is metal. The housing is brass, as is this one for the brushes. Beefier brushes on this guy. I don't know, this might be... Let's see, these are, oh, yeah, it's small. It's an interim size brush. So they didn't give you any, and you couldn't use your spare Hercules to replace your Bauer because these are slightly smaller. So the locking mechanism is similarly plastic, but at least this one stays together. Makes it somewhat easier to get into. Last but not least, let's open up the Hercules. Also fairly easy to disassemble. A notably much larger motor stator. Also epoxied wires. Brushes are on the side. And you have to take the back half of the clamshell off to get to them. It's a beefier brass housing, as you can see there. Yeah, each one gets heavier gauge brass and slightly larger. That's very interesting that they sort of maintain that whole thing. And the plastic parts inside this guy are much nicer. They use different switches for each one of these, and it would make sense that they'd have to be different current capacities, but I don't know, if I was a company, I'd want to standardize on parts so I don't have to stock so many individual parts. They did not do that here. So the strain relief on this guy also holds the switch in place. These other guys, the clamshell holds the switch in place. This has 2 screws that hold the strain relief, also holding the switch down, which means it'll move around less. They all have dust jackets on them. Even the least expensive one. And just the beefiness of the assembly, like this one's fairly thin gauge plastic. These two are much thicker plastic than the lower end models. PA6 GF30 for the Bauer. PA6 GF30 also for, oh, different size screws. That's also expensive. In order to get different size screws, you have to stock different size screws. This one's all the same screws. This one's all the same screws. This lower end model does not say on the mold on this side. It may say on the other side, but that's where all the parts are. I think the PA identifies the type plastic. I'm by no means an expert on this. And the GF, I think, is glass fiber. But I'm not 100% certain. Again, I'm not an expert when it comes to these sort of things. All right, so let's get these guys back together and look at the business end of these. One more observation before I get to the next step here and take the front apart is I noticed this before I took it apart that there's no wire management on this one. And the wires actually block the vents in the rear of this guy that help cool the motor. So it pulls air from the front. They all have fans in the front. This one, I can't tell if it's plastic. It looks like it's plastic, inexpensive PVC. In this one, these look like nylon fans in the front that take air from the front and blow out the back. And anyways, you don't want to block your vents. So this one's going to create a hot spot over here. Probably not great. All right, so as we get to the next step, we're going to take apart the gear, and you got to make a 90 gear, so there's probably some sort of helical worm gear or something like that that does the 90-degree translation. And since this is where all the force and wear is really going to take place, besides the brushes, this side is very important. One more observation I noticed here is that the O-ring on this guy that keeps the spacer intact, I think it could serve a useful purpose. If you were up on a high-rise or something and you're changing wheels, you'd have this one in your hand because you had to take it off. You're putting the new wheel on. You wouldn't want to be able to lose this and have this fall maybe to the ground and get lost. And that would be very problematic. So the O-ring would keep this spacer or this diameter adapter captive, which would probably be really handy. The shafts on all these guys look about the same. They all have a ground portion where the spacer sits on, so that's a positive. And I can't tell any other obvious differences other than these two are beefier. Like this one's significantly beefier than either two. They get beefier as it goes up. It's hard for me to imagine that that's something that often breaks on these, but maybe. Oh, and again, this bottom one is not keyed, so the other two, this piece would not be free to float. So with this one, if you stalled the wheel, the shaft could continue to move inside and damage the inside of the wheel because it'll just spin freely. These other two guys are both keyed, the base piece, keyed in the bottom, which is an extra step. That's two machining steps to put some flats in there and 2 steps to put flats in here. All right, let's open this guy up. They are machine screws. So are these self-tapping? No, they're not self-tapping. So they drilled and tapped. Sometimes on low-end stuff, they have these self-tapping screws, which basically have sort of like a cutting thread at the bottom. So they have to be hardened, but they cut threads as they go in. They use them on aluminum and plastic. Well, aluminum more than anything. I've seen them on many things I've taken apart. It's an inexpensive way that once you assemble it to get machine threads in there without actually having to go through a tapping step. All right, so it's a bevel gear. This is a very coarse cut gear on this guy. The faces look fairly smooth, but the top part is really rough. It's held on by a C-clip. And I'm guessing that underneath the C-clip and this gear is a bearing. There's also a needle bearing down below. I don't know if you can see that in there. And they did pack some grease in it. And it looks like this bevel gear is held on with a nut, which is interesting. Very interesting. Let's move on to the Bauer. Better screws on this guy, less expensive screws on the previous one. These also come out, feel much nicer. The threads feel much nicer. These were rough all the way. These are very smooth. Okay, much smoother feeling gear, much smoother bearing on this side. Oh, it's also much beefier. The thickness of the gear, it's smaller diameter, but it's much thicker. I don't know that matters a lot. If you could feel this in your hand, you feel it do this as it goes around. This one is perfectly smooth. And interestingly enough, I can't tell. Oh, it's a ball bearing. Okay, I thought maybe it was a sleeve bearing, but it's a ball bearing in there. This one's needle bearing. I can't tell what kind. This is a sealed bearing. This is an open needle bearing. So I can't tell if those are needle bearings in there or if they are just sealed, plain sealed bearings. Very smooth though. Also held on by a nut. Last but not least, let's get to the Hercules. Oh, plain old grease, white lithium grease in this one. I think that's interesting all by itself. Okay. Very, very smooth bearings. Also white lithium grease. Similar thickness wheel. Larger diameter. So it went largest diameters on the inexpensive one to smaller diameter, then back up larger again. I wonder why that is. And the bearings on this one are held on by a C-clip as well. This guy is maybe pressed on? Can't tell exactly. Needle bearings again on this one. So that one's ball bearings, this one's needle bearings. Similar worm gear, helical entry gear on all of these. This one looks like it's roughly machined, and these two look like they're powder sintered gears. But I'm not an expert, so I'm not 100% certain of that. There is more grease in the Bauer than even the Hercules. It is packed more fully. This one is rough machined or not machined at all. This casting where this seal meets, so the seal's not going to be particularly good. These are accurately machined castings on both sides. I'm not going to take the next step of heart because then I'd have to remove the helical gear. I'd have to take that nut off and remove the helical gear to get off. And all you're going to see on this side of the motor is the other end of the stator and find out what bearings. It would be nice to know what bearings are in there, but it might be really hard to get this back together reliably if I have to pull that shaft out of there, so I'm going to avoid doing that. But you can definitely tell the difference in quality between the three. It definitely steps up as you hit the higher end ones. As a matter of fact, it looks like this is much more complicated casting to make, probably to allow some cooling here through this space here. No, it's just air gaps. They're not open to the inside, so I'm not sure why they went to all the extra work. Maybe it's expansion. Maybe those expansion things to allow this case to expand while still holding these points in space and letting this flex a little bit. I don't know, because that's a lot of extra work in your casting to put these slots in here. They don't look like they're machined. They look like they're cast in. The design is definitely more refined as you get to the higher end model. So clearly, as you go from the lowest to the highest end, you're going to get much more longevity out of it. But for the weekend warrior, this one still might be fine long term. The grease is kind of nasty in here. You might want to open this up and replace the grease. Almost none of that grease made its way onto the gear. The gear itself is still pretty dry. So that's kind of unfortunate. When I put this back together, I'm going to load the grease on the wheel. Maybe replace the grease with some lithium grease. Yeah, let's scoop the grease out of this one and replace it with some better grease. So I got these other two back together. And I figured I'd take the grease out of here and replace it with something better than whatever kind of grease this is. So I think this is something you don't want to see. That's metal debris. You do not want to see that in the grease inside your mechanical device. There's some more. And I'm guessing because these gears are so rough that as they ran it a little bit, they started wearing in to mate with each other. Interesting sound the motor makes just vibrating in here. Oh, I'm probably going against, I'm probably going the wrong direction, which means that the brushes are rubbing funny going back the other way. That's what it was. Now we're going the right direction. Yeah. Oh, this is the lock. That's what this piece is. I've been wondering what this piece is the whole time. This piece is the lock that grabs in here. So interestingly enough, these two guys only have 3 locking positions. This one has 4. So this one will lock in each quadrant. That's what this guy is. Duh. Alrighty, so I took this guy off here. It's just a keyed gear. And they do have a bearing on the other side. It's just a crappy bearing though. And it's a Woodruff key. It's not a flat key, so it's a Woodruff key that sits in there. But this thing is incredibly crunchy feeling. So my guess is they did not use top-of-the-line bearings in there. And that's about it on this side, and I'm sure the other ones are very similar, but they clearly have better bearings because they're much, much smoother to the feel. As one final test, I thought what I'd do is I would use this sintered wheel before I throw it out, because it's so black, to check the RPM of these guys, just as curiosity. So this one claims it's 10,000 RPM. In no load, this one's measuring 7,900 RPM, so not quite matching what it says on the advertisement and on the side of the motor for that matter. All right, this next one claims 11,500 RPM. Measures about 9,800. Last but not least, we have the Hercules, and they're claiming to be 11,000 RPM. $10,150. So they're all a little bit lower than they're stating, at least based on the measurements of this guy, which they claim is 0.05%. I'm going to go grab a Hitachi and see what that one says. Here's an interesting note for the Hitachi. For unknown reasons, different size spanner wrench than all the Harbor Freight. Why couldn't the industry just standardize on one? Because look at the pin spacing. Just ever so slightly different. It wouldn't be that hard, for God's sakes. All right, so the Hitachi says it's 10,000 RPM. So the Hitachi measured about 8,900 RPM instead of 10,000. So they're all measuring low, or this guy's not quite that accurate, and it just is such an inexpensive device that it's crappy. So maybe I need to look into a better one of these. All of them are consistently close to what their stated value is, although I got to say the Chicago is much lower than all the rest. Alrighty, to sum this up, let's see. All of them function, to start with. The freewheel that comes with the Chicago tools and maybe the Warrior, I don't know since I don't have one of those, throw it right in the trash. That's where mine's going. It's not fiberglass reinforced. No reason not to have the extra safety. You might as well get it. Even the other Harbor Freight ones have fiberglass reinforcement. No reason not to have it. Nice plus is the small one does come with brushes, but the mechanism and everything on it is not designed for long-term use or daily use. The plastic is, I don't think is glass reinforced. It's much weaker, so if you drop it, it's probably going to break. And the locking mechanism, not that's something people use probably a ton, although I could see it being convenient, is also much cheesier. These two are much more robust, with the better quality going to the top end model. It comes with a wheel, which is a couple dollar bonus, but nice also comes with a couple of spare brushes, which is a huge plus. Well, a nice plus for long-term users. I think both of these would be fine to buy. I wouldn't buy this one at all, I don't think. Definitely the fit and finish is better on this one. The smaller diameter handle, so they made a more compact motor, is a little bit better in the hand than this one. So ergonomically, this one's better. The grip also, the side grip is also a little bit better. It's nice plus is the O-ring, keeping this retained. I actually like the paddle switch on the Bauer better than the Hercules. They're both fine. This one's got the little things to catch your roughness. It's just a little bit stiffer and wiggles a little bit more than the Bauer. The Bauer just feels a little bit more positive to me, but that's sort of a small quibble. So I think either of these would be fine, but it's interesting comparing all three of these next to each other. The differences in design, and if you do buy the cheap one, I'd take the grease out and replace it with some new grease, especially after letting it run for a little while, because it looks like the gears are wearing in or meshing, and you need to get all those metal particles out of there to reduce unnecessary early death. So I think that's it. I hope you find this useful. I thought it was a very interesting experiment, albeit a little bit of an expensive one. But if you guys really like it, leave a comment below and let me know, and I could possibly do more of these. I tend to reinvest all the money from the channel back into things like this so I can afford them. And I don't make very much, but you know, a few months worth I can do something like this. So anyways, I thank you for watching. I hope you find it useful. Hope to see you next time.